Grab your friends, Wargamers. Today we're talking about how to win at RPGs. Yes, you can win at RPGs, and you can do so using a much more rigorous framework than simply having fun. Here in the House of Wargaming, we like to challenge ourselves. We like to elevate our gaming and try to do things in a much more sophisticated way. We are not interested in the fast food experience. Well, I mean, sometimes it's a nice break, but generally, we're more fine dining types who like to push envelopes. And we're going to do that today by embracing, as you've seen, total player autonomy. That may seem like either a pipe dream or an impossibility. Let's dive into it. First thing you need to understand before we go any further is that we are now into the fourth, maybe fifth, depending on how you count it, decade of bad gaming. So many people love to brag about the fact that they have been gaming wrong for 4 decades, as though that somehow makes them an expert in how to game right. Not the case. The problem is that a long time ago, the gaming culture shifted and adopted a number of mindsets that are self-defeating. And they did so at the behest and largely in response to the direction of major companies. Specifically, RPG publishers are very much like Big Pharma. They're not interested in selling you a product that can provide a lifetime of entertainment. If they do, you never need to buy anything from them again. No. They want to sell you a product that gets you hooked on buying another product. Buy our product, get excited, and then get excited to consume the next product. It's an unending treadmill. It's a cycle, and it's one designed to keep you on the plantation. Well, here today, we're going to talk about how to break off that plantation. By the way, the little guys are just as bad at this. They're all trapped in the mindset of, we have to do a tremendous amount of groundwork before the game can even begin. And hey, guess what? For the low price of X dollars, I'll do the groundwork for you. This is a bad mindset. This is the mindset that the DM prepares and the players react. Get out of that mindset. Get into the mindset that everyone at the table is interested in the same thing. Building a campaign world that is rich and full and allows for a wide continuum of experiences. One of the major ways to think about campaign preparation that you see across the tabletop culture these days is this spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, you've got a railroad, and on the other side, you've got a sandbox. The railroad is characterized by a DM who writes a lovely story. It's a pretty hallway, and your characters are going to walk down that hallway. Maybe it forks once, but then it comes back to the main storyline that has been written. That's the way the railroad works, and you, by God, you are going to follow this story. Take a look at the Wizards of the Coast 5th edition, quote-unquote, adventures for an example of that. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what a lot of the OSR guys produce, and that is a sandbox where they say, I have a wide collection of locations and maybe events. You, as the players, have the freedom to stay inside the box. And you can go to whatever point you want, in whatever order you want, but you will stay in the box. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. As mentioned before, here in the House of Wargaming, we like to push beyond the boundaries. This artificial boundary of the sandbox is limiting, and we don't want to limit the adventure or the exploration. We like to sail off over the curve of the earth and see what's out there. So we're going to go beyond the sandbox, and we're going to go into the realm of total player autonomy. And we're going to sit down and tell the players, I don't have anything prepared. What I do have is 30 years of experience and 30 years of reading books that were not written after 1980. We have a head full of ideas, but I don't know which ones to use because I don't know which ones you're interested in, and I don't think you know which ones you're interested in either. Commonly called session 0 for some reason. The first session of a campaign is where you start hashing this out. What do you guys want to do? Now, bear in mind, as I said, We all have an equal share in this campaign and doing what we can to ensure that the campaign flourishes. When you grant players total autonomy, you're not granting them, well, you're granting them the ability to do whatever they want, but you're not granting them the freedom to do whatever they want, because freedom, properly applied, is directed towards something other than its own self. For instance, properly applied, freedom in the real world means the freedom to pursue meaning in your life. It means the freedom to live your life in adherence with the natural law, with God's law. That's what freedom means. And when you sit down at the table and say, players, you have the freedom to do whatever you want, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can do anything that you want. Not if we're striving towards the same goal of a long-lived and rich campaign. Players, given this power to begin creating the world and to begin shaping it together, have an obligation, a responsibility, and a duty to not just the GM, but to the other players, to create the world that everyone at the table is interested in engaging in. There is negotiation between the players for what kind of world this is going to be. Sometimes one player will dominate and sometimes another. To put this into another analogy, what we're talking about here is not a conductor sitting in front of an orchestra, and he'll point to the section, the instrument that he wants to take the lead right now. And then when he feels they've had enough time in the spotlight, he then takes the attention away and directs it to someone else. The DM, as the conductor, is the wrong way to think about this. Because when you sit around a table with your friends, maybe you're at a bar drinking beers, which one of you is the conductor? That's not how you think about this, right? That's not the way a social activity goes. Instead, you should be thinking about it as more of a free-form jazz quintet, where you've got 5 guys that are playing on theme and variation. And they're all going to have their own little ideas, but they're all going to have to take turns. Let me back off here and let him play around with this variation on the theme that we've got. And then at a certain point, he's going to step back and turn it over to someone else, or you're going to find a good harmony with someone else, or maybe you find an interesting discordant, through line that you're playing against type to one of the other instruments in this quintet. That's possible as well. You learn to communicate when you're in this situation non-verbally. A little nod of the head, or a little shift of the shoulders, or even, a bob of the knees. These are all subtle cues that you use to weave together 5 instruments, 5 voices, 5 players, to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. That's the kind of thing that we want to achieve with our tabletop role-playing games, and it's imminently achievable if you simply step back from the mindset of conductor, orchestra, and into the mindset of, hey, we're all free-form, adding ingredients to the goulash. Another analogy would be stone soup. Everybody brings what they have and they throw it in the pot. Now, what does this look like on a more practical level? This has all been kind of high and mighty. Let's bring it down to the level of the table. So the DM says, look, I don't know what we're going to play here. Maybe somebody says, I always wanted to do a stunty campaign. And everybody goes, yeah, dwarves would be great. Let's all be dwarves. Okay, now we're talking about a theme. And you can run all kinds of variations on that theme. Or everybody says, why don't we try to run a thieves guild? Everybody runs a thief. And now the DM is going to say, yeah, that's great. Let me see what I can work with here. And he broad strokes out a city that either has a thieves guild that is dying, or one that is, it doesn't have a thieves guild, but boy, howdy, does it really need one. You've taken these discrete ingredients and you've blended them together into something new and different and unusual. But what happens if you've got players that are playing against type? Joe sits down and says, I'm playing a square-jawed paladin of the old school type, the best kind of paladin there is. And Frank says, yeah, well, I want to play a necromancer. Now we come down to where you've got an issue where you have to deal with this responsibly. There's 2 aspects to this. One is that, look, we're at the table and we're all trying to work towards the same goal, We need to find a way that these two guys can work together. Why these guys would work together is a fascinating question, and resolving that tension is part of the game. Overcoming that challenge of a paladin and a necromancer working together, that's an interesting question. That will lead to some interesting adventures. When the session is over, if you're playing the game right, you've got a lot of downtime, those guys can now start hatching plans to thwart the other guys at the table plans. Send assassins after each other. Go to, seize a holy relic or an unholy relic before the other guy can. Now you've got some tension and the world is starting to take on a larger shape. Another example. A magic user says, hey, I need if you're playing AD&D, or basically any version of D&D properly, you're going to have patrons involved. And patrons are the guys that will help the low-level adventurers get to where they want to go. They're not Santa Claus. They're going to have demands that they have to make, and those demands have to be met. And then you get back into the negotiation with the rest of the table. Listen, guys, if you want me to be able to cast this higher-level attack spell, we're going to have to go over and do this adventure. I know you're not interested in it today, but at some point we're going to have to do this so that I can get this spell so that I can support you in the next adventure, right? This is the kind of negotiation that friends do. And this is the kind of negotiation that is valuable for role-playing games, and that you won't hear this kind of advice in the standard books that don't want to solve your problems for you, right? It's one of the great ironies of life is that this highly social activity was adopted by people that are really bad at social activities. Change your mindset from conductor, orchestra, to a group of friends who are building this campaign together. Oh, you know what? My primary character can't act in this adventure right now. I can't think of a reason why my paladin would help your necromancer. Does your necromancer have an NPC that I can play for today? I guess my paladin is going to keep doing downtime stuff, which is going to thwart your plans, while I help you with your plans. See how we all take turns carrying the ball here? This is how teams operate. This is how groups of friends operate. This is how a healthy tabletop role-playing game environment operates. If you adopt this mindset, you will find that it pays huge dividends in the long run as well. First of all, because as characters gather up henchmen and followers, it becomes too much work for a single DM to manage it all. Fine, let them do it. You need to come up with your followers. You need to come up with a sergeant who's going to boss your 20 men-at-arms around. You need to come up with a lieutenant who's bossing your 4 sergeants around, and the 80 men that you've got guarding your keep out there on the borderlands. That's on you now. I mean, let me know what it is, because I, as the DM, might be able to use that. Or if I know that there's an attack by the Lizard Man army, or the bandits attack, I need to be able to game that out in whatever form, so that I can come back next week and say, oh yeah, on Wednesday your keep got hit and you lost 12 guys, and oh, this is the one sergeant that got hit. What are you going to do next, right? But allowing the player to create that allows the character to have a stake in the campaign world. This is something he created. He is just as much the father of this campaign as the DM, and now he's got a much more significant buy-in. He put a lot more time and a lot more effort and a lot more imagination and creativity into this campaign world. And when bad things happen, it's his real-world time that is going to suffer for it. I shouldn't say suffer for it, because these are games, these are fun, but he's going to lose out, right? I spent 2 hours drawing up that castle, and a dragon just nuked it from orbit? Oh, I lost those 2 hours. Now it means something. Far more than if the DM said, hey, I spent 2 hours, and then the player's castle gets nuked. Oh, well, what is he out? He's not out to 2 hours. That's how you get the buy-in. Once you move in, and actually, this is where it gets even a little bit more complicated. The way we always think about this is that, oh, well, you start off with nothing, and then you build your way up to a barony, and now you've got a domain. Oh, God, you got to stop thinking that way. You need to start thinking about that barony from day one. That is domain level play, and that is the goal for your lower level character. Maybe your domain is just a hermit's wizard tower out in the woods somewhere. Maybe your domain is just a sacred grove for your druid, an hour's hike from the main city. And maybe he needs to find that grove, and maybe he needs to win that grove, and maybe he needs to convince the villages nearby, that it will be an asset to the community. All of these hooks for adventure just spontaneously arise when you play the game the way it was meant to be played. That domain level play now generates new NPCs. This is where the game really starts to shine because it takes on a life all of its own. The word that we've used to describe this kind of game is Chantisonian. You've got patrons, you've got high-level NPCs that are active almost right out of the gate. And some of those NPCs are going to rise and become more powerful, some are going to fall, some are going to be replaced by PCs. But they're all going to have their own ideas about what the world should be. They're all going to have their own plots and their own plans and their own schemes, and they're not all going to be in an alliance with each other. This is faction play, and faction play is where the game really blossoms up into the full potential of what it can be. And that's where you have something like, to use the earlier example, you've got the paladin who's now mid-level and he's got a lot of followers and he wants to stamp out evil in the realm. You've got a necromancer who is also 5th or 6th level and he's raised up an undead army and he's in the process of trying to excavate a tomb of the Dominator. And how those guys interact becomes very interesting, particularly given that they're not the only two factions. There's a Thieves Guild that's playing them both off each other. There is a couple of wizards out there in the hinterlands who are using these guys for their own purposes as well. It can get really complicated, and it can be, and one man trying to manage this, probably too much. And that's where the Chantisonian faction play comes in, because there's no reason that those have to be non-player characters all of the time. There's no reason they even have to be players in the campaign itself. So Chanticleer is a feller over on Twitter who popularized this most recently, and that's why we call it Chantisonian, because it's a combination of his style of play, and I think he's actually running 5th edition D&D. So these don't just work with AD&D, these concepts work with any version of the Godfather of role-playing games. But Chanticleer, that's Chanticleer, is doing what Dave Arneson did back in the day. What Major David Wesley Powell did back in the day with his Brownstein. He wound up recruiting guys that weren't involved in the table at all. Now, he's got a blog. I'll put a link in the description for you so you can check it out for yourself. Proof of concept. Definitive evidence that this style of total player autonomy works. He said, man, I don't know what this NPC would do. I don't have time to think about it. Hey, he reached out to some of his friends and said, hey, would you be interested in running one of these NPCs for me? It's real time. Just, read the blog and then you tell me what you think that NPC's next plan would be. How would he respond to the events at the table? A couple of paragraphs get sent to him via email and he can incorporate that. A fascinating thing happened. A couple of those, quote, NPCs that were run by campaign outsiders came to heads. And they started having conflict of their own. This is all happening in the background of the tabletop, mind you. But it's all happening nonetheless. It's all very organic, it's very natural, and it allows for independent perspectives on the campaign to erupt from the earth and start butting heads in a way that's very difficult for even the best DM to do. All of us are smarter than any of us. And when you can start outsourcing the intellectual labor of managing all of these NPCs, that's when things get beautiful. So the take-home message today is don't be afraid to give your players a lot more freedom. Make sure they understand that power, if you will, with that power comes great responsibility. They should know what that means. They're in this hobby, for crying out loud. They know what you're talking about. They'll pick up on the reference right away. And just once in a while, you'll have to nudge them. Hey, you guys need to work this out. It's not my job. You figure out how this is going to work at the table. Maybe try gaming like adults for a change, and maybe you'll have better gaming. You won't find the secrets in any supplement, in any setting book. Now, the best thing you can do is read How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's one of the core rule books for any role-playing game. So, again, total player autonomy. Don't be afraid to implement it. It will lead to things like increased numbers of NPCs, a larger, richer, more detailed and organic campaign world, and it will naturally give rise to faction play, where the friction that occurs in the campaign world happens of its own accord, not by arbitrary DM fiat. Go forth. Think about this. Change your mindset. Be a better gamer, and you'll have a better game. Till next time, I'm praying for you.